Hey everybody, welcome to CMMC War Room. We'll give a couple minutes for folks to come on in and join us. We appreciate your time. I know it's a Friday, TGIF to everyone out there. We are very grateful for your time and grateful for the opportunity, with our guests to spend this time to really talk about how to really tackle the tough problems related to DFARS and CMMC compliance. So we will begin in just a minute. In the meantime, I just want to talk about, there's a lot of moving pieces here. We just finished CMMC Day, and I'll talk about an update related to that. I've got the NIST 800-171, the revision 3 just released, which for all practical matters isn't impactful now, but there's some important key components I'll mention just shortly. And also we've got a great CMC War Room coming up next Friday with Dr. Ron Ross to talk about an exclusive interview, which I'm very grateful for, revision 3, and talk about what changes were made and the impact related to us in the future. That's a year or two out, so it's not there's no sense of urgency for now. So we will also talk about the fact that we've got CCP classes ongoing. Dave Gray has got a CCP class coming up, and we've also got a CCP class myself next week starting on Monday. Dave's is starting on Monday. And so if you know him from LinkedIn and you're interested in a CCP class, please reach out to him. He's an outstanding instructor, and we're very grateful for him being the CMMC Industry Standards Council. We also have another CCP class, but I can't remember exactly who's doing it. It'll come to mind. So we've really got ongoing things, a lot of moving pieces within the ecosystem, a lot of moving things related to CMC policy and DFARS policy and compliance, and our cup runneth over. So with that, we will get started. All right. So thank you everyone for your time today. This is the CMC War Room, and my name is Regan Edens, and I am the host. And I'm very grateful to be here with Richard Wakeman from Microsoft and Anthony Cochenour from Hoplite Industries. They are fantastic individuals. They have been members of the Coalition of the Willing here for really since the beginning and before the beginning, right? And we are very grateful for their time. We have been, the ecosystem is diligently working to really tackle the problems for small and mid-sized businesses and the problems across the supply chain. And so today we're going to talk about the Holy Grail. And the Holy Grail really is about making this simpler, making this, reducing the cost, and making this scale across the CMC ecosystem. So with that, I want to thank our sponsors for them within their participation and their support and their marketing and their contribution. We are very grateful for each of their contributions, not only just in sponsorship, but also their contribution across the ecosystem and what they do for small and mid-sized businesses, and for all sorts of different participants within the ecosystem. It's a combination really of a private-public partnership between the MEPs, between our higher education with SMU, and of course our tools and our service providers with Virtue and Quick Track. And of course the Coalition of the Willing that these folks participate with them in the CMC Industry Standards Council. It's a volunteer organization, and those folks are truly dedicated and have passion for this mission. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate them. We've got folks that have been there really since the very beginning with the Cyber AB's Industry Standards Committee, and really working together and spending an enormous amount of time dedicated to helping address these issues and provide clarity and consistency, and being able to contribute in many, many different ways that are truly behind the scenes. I also want to welcome Neosystems. And Neosystems, I love Neosystems. They've been a partner. I've personally been able to contribute to their town halls since the very beginning of CMMC. And Neosystems is a spectacular organization as a managed service provider that offers a unique offering in the way that they really wrap their arms around you and help small and mid-sized businesses meet these requirements really end to end. So, Stuart, it can, for which I have endearing respect for, and many, many others within the Neosystems family, because it really is, and their contribution and their dedication. And Greg, they help take care of our clients, and we work hand in hand within the CMC ecosystem and within the CMC Industry Standards Council as well. So we are grateful for their participation. We also want to just highlight the fact that we're going to talk about some hard stuff today. And the reason why I consistently bring up Aerogland within the CMC War Room is the fact I want you to know that this can be done. This can be done by a small, mid-sized company, 75 people, with a small IT team, with a whole lot of work and a whole lot of dedicated people around them. They spent a long time and a lot of sweat equity preparing for this, their voluntary assessment that Redspin conducted. And Redspin honestly did a superb job with the Joint Voluntary Service assessment, and also with the support of TMAC. TMAC is the Texas MEP, and they have done also a superb job. We love Daryl and his team, and have been working truly hand in hand with them again since before. So prior to CMMC and the Cyber AB. So we are grateful for the longevity of those relationships, for the trust and the integrity of those relationships. And if you are in Texas, you should reach out to TMAC, because they will not steer you wrong. And we help them, and they use our CMMC EPU implementation guidance and reference documentation, which Aerogland used. And we'll talk a little bit about that today on the secure by default and compliant default solutions. But the reality is when they tell you something, you can count on it's reliable and consistent, because they've got that point of reference in using our documentation to navigate these requirements with certainty. With that, I also want to talk about in our open for business segment that we try to include within the CMC War Room. I had a discussion yesterday with a fantastic ERP solution called Global Shop Solutions that are out of Texas. They're out of the Woodlands, and with a client, helping a client meet compliance standards. And I got to tell you, this is the very first discussion that I've ever had, and I helped with literally hundreds of companies over the past 7 dog years of my life. And Global Shop Solutions was the very first ERP team that I talked to that I didn't have to explain what CMMC was. I didn't have to explain what FedRAMP Monitor was. I didn't have to explain to them what DFARS 7012 was. And I'm sure there are large ERP providers out there, and there are that clearly understand these requirements. But Global Shop Solutions is an excellent ERP solution for small and mid-sized companies. And so I genuinely appreciate the fact that they did their homework, that they understand this, and they've got about 15% of their clients that they've already migrated into their AWS GovCloud. Okay. So if you need help, or if you're not sure that your ERP solution is compliant, reach out to Alex, and you can have trust and confidence that they're going to steer you in the right direction. All right. So remember that we have to meet requirements right now. NIST 800-171, underneath DFARS 7012, the SPRS score to be eligible for our current contracts. And of course, CMMC is coming soon. All right. So let's talk about very quickly about the CMC update. We had CMC Day just last week, and it was a rip-roaring event. Okay, it was max participation, and I'm very grateful for that as well. I got to present on control technical information. We're going to do a CMC War Room on that, a very deep technical dive in the near future. The OMB is coming out, Office of Management of Budget. They're the ones who control all of these rules, the DFARS 7012 and the DFARS 7019, 7020, and 7021. Well, they're coming out with a FAR rule that's expected to be released in 30 days. The reason why I highlighted is that FAR rule hits all federal acquisition regulation. So it will be, when adopted, about probably a year out, it will hit every single contract with that has CUI in it across all federal agencies, from prime contractors all the way down to the lowest tier. Okay, so that is a game changer. That is a game changer, folks. So you should expect, and I hope that those folks that are participating within the DoD ecosystem do exceptionally well in meeting these requirements and being prepared to meet other federal agency requirements and have the leading edge and the competitive advantage as these requirements are adopted. Okay, the CMC rule for DoD is being finalized and will be reviewed by the SBA, and then the OMB's got, I think, 60 or 90 days to review that rule, and then the language will be released for public comment. There is a small chance that it could be an interim rule. It should be. There is an absolute urgent national security interest because we face adversaries which are intending to destroy us. And I wish that were hyperbole. I wish that were exaggeration. That is the case. And it is urgent and meaningful, not just for compliance sake, to protect controlled and classified information. And we are at the edge of potential conflict and really volatility throughout the world. So that CMC rule and the impact of that being a potential, being a interim rule, really is meaningful to the national security interest. So with that, just stay tuned and continue to be diligent and to continue to move forward, meeting the DFARS requirements and meeting your SPRS requirements and preparing for CMMC. So DoD continues to work with industry, and I've got to tell you, we have come a long way in our relationship, in the hand in glove relationship with the CMC PMO, with the NIST folks, with the DIBCAC folks and DCMA, really working hand in hand together, along with the Cyber AB, of course. I don't speak for them, even though I used to be a director there. But I can tell you from being intimately involved in this ecosystem, I am really grateful for us coming together, in part with the CMC Industry Standards Council, but also the C3PAO Forum and other forums out there, working together hand in hand to really bring clarity and enable scalability and reduce costs for you guys out there who really have to embrace these requirements and meet these requirements to continue to prosper. So with that, NIST 800-171 and Rev 3 it has been released for public review and public comment up until July 14th. But stay focused on DFARS 7012 right now. Although we do have we've got the CMC War Room coming up next Thursday with Dr. Ron Ross, who is really bent over backwards, I've got to tell you, in engaging industry. They're going to have 2 review periods for the NIST 800-171 Revision 3. That is extraordinary. And Victoria Pellatori did an excellent overview at CMMC Day. And they're going to have, they themselves on June 6th are going to have their own, webinar. But it's maxed out already, 1,000 participants. And I think it was done before 4 o'clock on CMC Day when it was released. But we're going to spend an hour-long conversation with Dr. Ross. We're going to talk, it's going to be technical, okay? We're going to talk about the key differences for those folks out there so they can compare and contrast between Revision 2 and Revision 3 from a practitioner's perspective or an IT perspective, and also touching on the important perspective from a small, mid-sized business and understanding the comparison and contrast between the two and how it impacts both the prime contractor all the way down to the lowest tier. All right. So stay tuned for that. That's next Thursday at 1 p.m. All right. With that, I want to introduce my guest, and we're going to go full screen with our guest here just shortly, and we'll cut back to the slides. In the fact that I want to talk about Richard Wakeman from Microsoft, and Richard is an extraordinary ecosystem participant, and really has been from the get-go. Really fully supporting CMC Industry Standards Council, fully supporting the ecosystem and his time and his attention and engagement across all sorts of different webinars, many different topics, probably a couple hundred, I would think, Richard, over the past several years. And working hand in hand also with the different working groups that have supported the Cyber AB and really meeting these requirements. And we also have Anthony Cochenour, and Anthony Cochenour is with Hoplite Industries. And Anthony Cochenour and I have been patriots in on cyber arms since really 2014. And I can't tell you how much I truly really appreciate his quiet and professionalism and what he contributes completely in the shadows to keeping the cyber community safe and secure and international security interests. He leads a company called Hoplite Industries, and it has extraordinary capabilities, and we'll touch on those as we move through with these requirements. So with that, let's talk about Richard. So secure by default and compliant default architecture. Talk about what does that concept mean for that average person sitting out there, and for those wondering why this is the Holy Grail.
Yeah, well, in terms of looking at secure and compliant by default, it is about building a way that you can have both a repeatable and scalable solution that could be deployed by the SMB or even across the entire DIB industry to include the construction of, for example, enclaves or even full enterprise environments. The way I like to look at it is, and this is, you'll hear me talk quite a bit over the course of time about this shared scope of responsibility model that you have between, for example, a cloud service provider, in my case, Microsoft, versus maybe a managed service provider, but the end customer is the one that's going to be responsible for getting certified for CMMC or demonstrating compliance, right, with NIST 800-171, DFARS 7012. The real benefit of secure by default and compliant by default is that you have a known configuration, right? Okay. That is repeatable, as I mentioned, and that it can come packaged together with documentation, procedures, and all the others that we'll get into here. But that is in alignment with an environment that, for example, assessors are familiar with. They can come in, they've been able to review it before. You have a common set of patterns and practices that ultimately would help you to demonstrate compliance. But if you start with the various different levels of cloud services, they're not all equal, right? There's always going to be some number of infrastructure that it will still be on premises, whether it's just your endpoints or devices. In the case though of an on-premises data center, like a traditional server racks, et cetera, that you may host at your premises, you own 100% of the compliance, right? And as you start to adopt the cloud, for example, moving into Azure and moving servers and workstations such as virtual machines, well, now you get to take advantage of the cloud infrastructure, and that would include physical security controls, host infrastructure, network controls, et cetera, that are managed by the cloud service provider. And it has a known configuration, it has a known set of compliant and security considerations. So for example, whenever you go into the cloud, you can look at which authorizations that are held, which standards. Here at Microsoft, we have a baseline that would be at that NIST 853, or ultimately a FedRAMP high impact level, right? That you're able to take advantage of, and that has a full assessment report, et cetera, that assessors can also look at how the cloud service provider would meet their obligations. And now you get to inherit those controls. Now there's a limited number of controls for infrastructure as a service. I mean, physical security and so forth give you, a dozen or so controls that you can fully inherit. But you get partial inheritance on close to 87 different controls, leveraging, for example, reference architectures and landing zone. But where it really resonates, I think, with most folks is getting into software as a service, because you start to distribute more and more of that responsibility for how the environment's secured and ultimately how it's configured as well to the cloud service provider in such a manner that what's left behind for the customer to really put an emphasis on would be around like data classification, accountability. It would be around client endpoint protection, right? Making sure that your devices meet NIST 800-171. Right. And of course, you can't deny identity and access management, that, giving people access control into the environment. Right. So with software as a service, you get there where literally all you got to do is turn some knobs and dials, implement a few capabilities like Purview, we even help you guide through that with our Purview compliance manager that has a set of templates specifically for CMMC. Now we don't go and configure it for you, right? So there's still, some knobs and dials that the customer would need to turn, which can be pretty time consuming. So having, industry standards that can be agreed upon on, hey, which knobs and dials should you put?
Right.
I would almost call it like a STIG that you would apply to the cloud.
Sure, exactly. Yeah. Well, that's a really great explanation, and it harkens back really. I mean, Anthony and I, when we started back in the trenches, I know he's laughing. When we started back in the trenches back in 2014, when we would have to explain to CIOs why it's important that they should secure their environment, right, to keep them from being schwacked by the bad guys. And we it's been a very steep learning curve from industry, right? And really, cybersecurity went from the sort of back room, skill set, or the basement skill set, really all the way up through to the boardroom, right? It is the focal point. But when we always think about the small mid-sized business, Anthony and I coined this term years ago, a security-defined architecture or security-defined network. So Anthony, talk about that security-defined network and really how that applies to what we're talking about. And how does that help lift the burden off of small mid-sized businesses when we think in terms of DFARS 7012 and CMMC?
Certainly. I think there's kind of two ways to get to Rome, so to speak, in thinking through this. I think the kind of a legacy way of thinking is we'll migrate what we have from its current state of affairs into a more secure posture, whatever that may be, whatever the target may be, in this case, CMMC. And I think the healthier way of thinking that I think is something that you and I have always shared is let's reimagine what the environment should look like. And through that reimagining what the environment should look like, let's move this idea that IT overall, with cybersecurity being a component, is simply a segment, a contributor of productivity, an enabler to the business. Rather than traditional thinking there, where really we're at a point in history where cybersecurity within the DIB is a pillar. It's a necessary pillar of all of these organizations, whether it's realized or not. And so this security defined architecture really, and building on what Richard said, everything that we can take to SaaS, everything that we can take to cloud, everything that we can hand over to managed service providers comfortably, certainly has its place. But invariably, especially with the manufacturing heavy segment, there's a lot of metal benders in the DIB that have weird and different things. They have CNC machines. They have, very exotic, 3D printing sintering machines. They have things that, maybe much to the chagrin of IT, don't fit into cloud. And so that security defined architecture really puts us in a position where we have to be able to monitor effortlessly. We have to ensure that, whether you fully subscribe to zero trust or you simply look at it, that, you go to a micro segmentation sort of perspective where everything needs to perform its function, whatever it may be, a paper printer, a 3D printer, a CNC mill, what have you. All of our devices need to perform these functions. However, they need to be segmented. So this idea, the same idea that we would have with minimum required access for, identity access management and control, apply that to all the non-human things. And really what you end up with is a very minimalist approach in that we only allow what's absolutely necessary in a physical environment, very much matching up to what Richard was describing in Azure GovCloud, GCC high type environments, where you have all of the makings for security, and rather than being forced to design those things are there, and they're simply part of the tapestry of they're physically and logically a part of the network. Be that your route switch environment, traditional firewalls, up to and including internet access, reimagining how users access data. Do users need access to all data? Do they need access to traditional file shares, or will virtual desktop and secure cloud sharing of files, secure transit of email, things of that nature? Can we do the same business by reimagining these kind of critical parts of IT that we've come to take for granted? So that security defined architecture doesn't mean that we take things away. It means that we strip away the things that make us inherently less secure and provide better solutions, and always strive to strike that balance of convenience versus security, but never yielding to that which must be compliant.
In this regard, it really makes the security and compliance thoughtless to the adopter, except for the things that they're responsible for, right?
Absolutely. And that's a huge component to make sure that you're not, the effort to achieve compliance is not really pointed at breaking culture. Certainly a shift in culture, but making it such that you can continually strike that balance of that which is secure and compliant and still convenient to the extent that it can be, I think is probably the best way to put that. And sometimes those involve hard conversations. Sometimes, people will kind of, with a tear in their eye, wave goodbye to something like Salesforce.com or things along those lines. But that said, just like, you had mentioned earlier in the intro, there are solutions out there. And as time goes on, we're seeing more and more segments of industry, not just kind of saying, yes, we can do some of these compliance things, but truly embracing compliance as a business enabler. And, as a nation, as far as national security, we all gain those benefits when we have more partners, like Microsoft and many others out there to help us along the way.
Well, and there is, it can be hard when you're transitioning from Salesforce.com to Salesforce.gov. There is some transition, right? And that's sort of the angst related to, okay, well, is it the same? Am I going to get the same functionality? Can I, and the wringing of the hands, is everything going to turn out okay? And
who can I email?
Yeah, email, same thing, of course. Yeah, and that's common. And I wanted to sort of, picture's worth 1,000 words. And for people out there sort of thinking about this, I want to sort of paint this picture that most organizations have a mix really of commercial and defense products and services, right? And so we're challenged in a way in that if we start to the left and move to the right, our authorized users that are in our current environment are usually not fully qualified and not fully trained to know their responsibilities related to CUI and meet the requirements. And then we've got CUI inside of our environment that we received, and that surely most organizations end up creating far more CUI than they actually receive. So we've got these legacy computers, and legacy computers have CUI on them, but they don't meet requirements. And of course, that matriculates into whether we're on-prem or hybrid or in the cloud. Our servers, again, and our applications have not been retrofitted to meet requirements, and the configuration management normally is a mess. And so you've got it's really an undisciplined environment. Now, when we think in terms of what the cloud looks like, whether it's our current our network architecture on-prem within our company, or whether it's a hybrid, or whether it's in the cloud, fully in the cloud, the reality is that most of the requirements related to CMC, most organizations, or DFARS 7012, most organizations aren't meeting. And so they're sending email back and forth with CUI. Those don't meet requirements. And most of them use Office 365 commercial tools, which don't meet requirements. And if they do have a managed services, or they have their own organic IT, there's a lack of experience or lack of maturity there to be ready, because in processing, storing, transmitting CUI, you have to embrace much higher standards, that FedRAMP moderate standard. Or if you're just providing the security services, you have to meet the identical standard that's related to the DIB company. And most managed service providers really don't understand that standard, in my experience, and they're not prepared. The other two things I want to point out is in this sort of this baseline environment that we see is that the sharing of information, sometimes between the DoD contract, the prime contractor, or sometimes the DoD directly, that sharing process does not meet requirements, right? It's over email, or it's in some way that's really is not isn't compliant because one or more of the organizations doesn't really understand the nature of what the CUI is, or that the information is unmarked or misunderstood. Also, in relationship to our cloud services, we've got lots of cloud services. As I mentioned with Global Shop Solutions, it's the only ERP that we've talked to, except for the major ERPs, that really have understood these requirements at all. And so seeing that, and seeing the cloud service providers really wake up to the fact that there is this burgeoning market, that the emerging market, that's going to have to meet these requirements. Most of these organizations in the cloud services are really focused primarily, or if not 99.9%, on commercial requirements. And so many are just not aware of what the expectations are. So, talk a little bit, Anthony, about reducing the burden off of the organization when you start thinking about, managing this environment and thinking about secure by default or compliant default.
I really think it comes down to, as we often say, compliance follows the data. And if we think about these challenges through that, with that mindset, it actually kind of it drastically simplifies how we go about dealing with some of these challenges. One of the most common things, and I know Richard and the Avast teams at Microsoft do this on a regular basis, but one of the key things to consider is if compliance follows data, perhaps something as simple as moving the data into an already compliant, again, secure by default, compliant by default environment, and rather than changing the nature of the data, nature of the applications, rather change how we interact with the data. How do we access that data? How do we securely transit that data? But simply by virtue of picking the data up, moving it into a compliant by default environment, changing how we access it versus being able to say, I have it on a backup drive and I have it on my laptop, if there's a server in the other room, what have you, we're going to move that into a compliant by default environment, be that cloud, be that hybrid, or be that on-premise, and change how we interact with it, typically through virtual desktop infrastructure, VDI, and similar means, remote desktop protocol, things like Citrix, many others out there that allow us to basically have a qualified window into our CUI. CDI, CTI, what have you. Those basic things can make it so that we have a very powerful tool, and that leaves us to deal with smaller things like what CUI must we have on premise, what CUI must we possess, what CUI must we transit between ourselves and qualified partners and contract holders, things of that nature. So we end up with this kind of dimensional reduction if we kind of think critically first about compliance follows data, control where data lives, control where data is transited, control what data we must have in our physical possession. It ends up becoming a lot less daunting and gives us manageable, scalable solutions where we can map industry solutions to these things simply by changing those, a couple of basic mindset items.
So I want to tease on something that you said just now, and what Richard said is duplicatable and repeatable, right? With consistency. Richard, how can this approach really help us really tackle the challenges related to prime contractors and their supply chain?
Yeah, and I'll pull on that thread, following the data. Oftentimes we even look at like what the scope of the systems would be for both NIST 800-171 and, of course, what you would have for your compliance boundary used by an assessor, that there is, ultimately, like, let's just take, for example, there's a set of compensating controls that we get into discussions with quite frequently, especially for those that are in the commercial side of the house, is say, hey, we've got a compensating control. It says, we don't put CUI in email, and that we would, for example, apply encryption on attachments if we were to. The challenge, though, is that, if you look at this world, especially a collaborative world where you're interacting both with your customer, maybe in the DoD, your supply chain, subcontractors, et cetera, that you don't have control over that. So if you look at bringing that data in, or if it's sent into you via email and it's unmarked and unlabeled and unencrypted, well, now you have a spill event that you have. Maybe it wasn't your fault, but let's just say if you compare and contrast that to going into a government cloud, you raise the bar in terms of the level of I would say security controls that we put into place. It's not that commercial is less secure, it's just that it is designed to protect controlled and classified information as a baseline. It's a US sovereign cloud, for example, that gives you those protections. So even if you receive that email unencrypted, at least it's still protected within that specific secure baseline, in which case you can make that argument that it is secure by default in terms of being able to apply, for example, even additional protections to it, knowing that email is in fact in scope, right? It's not out of scope that a lot of companies start off with.
The idea here is that, it by engaging sort of educating and training providers out there, Microsoft partners, for example, managed service providers that are knowledgeable about these requirements and qualified, managed service providers to recognize that they're going to process, store, and transmit CUI, and they're engaging the FedRAMP moderate process or equivalent process, right, to be able to meet these requirements. Or managed service providers who realize, look, that's a bridge too far. I've got to scale it back, and I can't process or store or transmit CUI. And so I'm gonna do these alternate sort of compensating approaches so that I can stay in the lane that I'm best qualified for and engage other partners or other providers, so that I can provide fully compliant solutions in my relationships with my clients. One of the things in the secure by default idea is the idea. I was thinking about this last week, and Stuart, it can really help me to see this with some clarity. It said that, it put together a breakdown that I really should have thought of beforehand, but he really grouped what are the controls that are related to specifically policies or procedures or tasks, and that are addressed by personnel that are executing cybersecurity functions. And that really relates to about 42% of those requirements, right? And then what are those that are related to IT personnel or related to specifically to software, hardware, or just by both, right? And that's about 58% of the controls. So what I was thinking is that when we approach secure by default and compliant default methodology, the idea here is that the combination, the hand and glove combination, is that you have comprehensive documentation, because templates are helpful if you know what to fill in the blank, but most organizations don't really know what to fill in the blank with, right? And so if you have tailored reference documentation unique to the reference architecture and unique to the solution, and then you've got this ability to train and educate about those policies and those procedures and what the responsibilities are owned by the company. Now you've got the ability to really have a business process and an operational process and your flow of CUI within that environment, your production or your services environment, which really complements that turnkey solution or secure by default solution that the provider or multiple providers really come together to try to provide you. And so in my mind, that really lays the groundwork for, okay, well, let's think about this. So if we've done this and we have, we have 42% and we have 58%, and we have solutions either independently or as bundled solutions come together, that with knowledgeable providers really does empower them to really get the OSC off of the ground, or the company off of the ground, to meet this 7012 and NIST standard 171 implementation much more quickly and much more efficiently, because they're not encumbered by their legacy systems. And that's quite the issue, and quite laborsome to really rehabilitate legacy computers. And Anthony mentioned VDIs, right? If you import that VDI and you have the appropriate controls and security policies in place, that really lifts the burden from those legacy systems, which may be quite messy for organizations to clean up. So the idea was okay, all right, if we do the top part, then now equipping and enabling the CMMC of the DFARS 7012 really focuses on two halves of the problem. First half is CMMC or DFARS related documentation, comprehensive, not driven by fill in the blank, but driven by really guidance and implementation. Very similar to what we did with AeroGlen and with CMMC EPU. And then also based on a reference architecture, uniquely based on a reference architecture, whereas the 58% of that lift in that burden, if you've got a knowledgeable and capable provider who represents or bundles solutions, or solutions come together, now you really got a hand in glove function here. What do you guys think about that? Either one?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I talk about this quite frequently. I think it was like 4 different layers, right? Especially if you're looking at adoption of meeting the and demonstrating controls set with NIST 800-171 on a cloud service. You know, that the bottom layer is the cloud service provider has a full body of evidence. It would include FedRAMP, DoD SRG impact levels, et cetera, that you get to inherit. Over that is a secure and compliant by default architecture, right? Topic of this discussion that says, here is a set of configuration that you would apply to this, to have a solution and architecture in alignment with that secure by default, and packaged together with it, you would have all the documentation. As long as you don't color too far outside the lines or make, considerable changes over what that specific set of documentation is, you should be able to just take it and turn it right over to an assessor, and in combination with, operations and monitoring and incident reporting. But that's where you enter that third layer. So for many, I see, especially the SMB, reaching out and using managed service providers, MSPs, that can do much of that, so they can outsource that set of activities. That leaves, at the top of the cake, if you will, is just the final requirement that the customer would have to implement. And the more uniform that environment can be, of course, in terms of being able to do a secure by default, maybe for the productivity suite or for the virtual machines and everything that you would run for VDI, then those all can follow those patterns that would be the true accelerator to compliance.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm thinking that from a managed services perspective, Anthony, how is this helpful to you? And from a managed services perspective out there, I want to learn, I want to participate in the marketplace, because Hoplite, Neo Systems, KTL, Summit 7, many others can't do it all themselves, right? And so there's this enormous blue ocean. So how does a managed service provider really engage to use this and use this approach as really a benefit?
I would actually lead with the human element. So something that Richard mentioned, with the outsourcing piece. I think a lot of business leaders, especially certainly some technology leaders, SMB and up in scale, look at MSP, MSSP engagements as an all or nothing, meaning that if I engage an MSP, I'm somehow alienating, or I plan to alienate IT. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I think in our reality is that we're here to help with the things that IT can't or won't do.
Right.
If we take a look at traditional, especially in SMB, they need to make sure that productivity is there. It's enabled by internet access, email is flowing, people can, use file print services, and then, whatever technology enabled solutions above that. None of that typically involves anything other than basic cybersecurity. And so that's, I think, where the initial layers of MSP management come into play, building on, repeatable, trusted, demonstrated solutions. We're basically there to do the things that IT can't or won't. And when I say we, the MSP, MSSP community overall. And so looking at it from the human perspective, it helps us to first kind of draw those, what are in reality, the real dividing lines of what we're there to do versus, we're not there to I don't want to control your printer. Especially if it's in the commercial environment, not pursuant to any compliance solution, continue doing that. Reality is that the building upon these solutions, providing customers almost an easy button of sort to be able to say that I'm going to pick up my compliance data, move it, and that will be separated. Actually, that's a huge burden lifted off of traditional IT, and also keeps those commercial cost components the same. Versus, the division by zero of, as a business leader, as a business owner, how do I make this whole compliance thing pencil when I look at it together? You start to separate it out into the different grains of sand, gets to be a lot easier to manage and deal with, to say, okay, maybe I don't need 150 E5 licenses. Maybe I don't need 150 VDI seats. Maybe I need 20 because that's the portion of my staff that will be dealing with that. And so we'll separate those things out. And so I think there's from the MSSP perspective, there's a great deal there, and we need to understand what our lane is. And our lane typically is not displacing traditional IT. It's to be that enabler, that quiet foundation that those customers can take a step up onto and gain the benefits of a lot, years and years worth of hard work that they don't have to duplicate.
I could not agree with you more. In fact, me. I mean, I'm very a fiercely loyal individual, and the worst thing that we want to do is rip and replace, the organic IT guy that's in the company, or the trusted, firm that's right down the street, that's there in every crack of the whip or need. And the idea here is that, there are firms that will specialize in this skill set and specialize in this activity that will really relieve the burden both off the managed service provider helping their customer, execute their business, and also relieve the burden off the organic IT that's really completely overwhelmed with their current requirements as it is, and can have this trusted relationship with someone who helps them, be a rock star, really, honestly. So with that in mind, let's talk about this and just walk us through this diagram, Anthony, from a managed services perspective, and from what your experience, in a very similar setup.
Certainly. So, if you take a traditional SMB with file and print on premise, a mix of commercial and CUI data, and you draw some squiggly lines around the CUI data, and you imagine, picking up the data and the systems that access that and moving it into an enclave, be that public cloud, GCC high type environment, or private enclave in another a physical sovereign data center environment that's managed, and taking only the segment of the workforce in an SMB organization that needs to deal with CUI, a bit of retraining, maybe issuing some separate CUI only endpoints that are configured to be compliant, and making it such that they have a slightly different avenue through which they access their data. That's kind of like that first big vertical segment where you see the VDI icons there just left of center. With those employees accessing that data through that new portal, if you will, that new window into their CUI environment. You'll notice that everything to the left of that, work from home, small office, home office, industrial and manufacturing environments, those things on the commercial side, they remain the same. We're simply picking the data up that looks and smells a little different, moving that into a compliant by default environment, changing how we access it. And it's really from there that we gain a lot of benefits, moving a little further right, where we kind of do all the mix-ins. We consider, okay, what are we doing for email and collaboration? Well, Microsoft 365 and Teams in a GCC high environment, when and where that meets the needs there. We get into ERP and other collaboration. CRM is another big one. With how do we deal with this customer data? NIST 800-171 Rev 3, customer information, accounting information, PII, PHI, all in scope. So now this puts more of a target on things like CRM type systems, where, heck, a lot of these SMB organizations just need to interact with their customers and their partners. They need CRM. So being able to move this data allows us to draw some clearer boundaries and look very hard at what are the third-party integrations, what are we running perhaps in the sovereign cloud environment, wherever it may be. And most importantly, going back to the human element that I think is very easy to miss as we talk about documentation and technical controls, over time, how do we constantly demonstrate that we are following the practices, monitoring data 24 hours a day, automatically generating all of the information and artifacts that we need over time to say that, hey, we saw an event, we dealt with an event, here's what it was, we're going to move on. It was a speed bump versus a cliff. All those things become easier.
Well, I agree with that, Anthony. I apologize, there was a bit of a delay. So Richard, let's talk about email, because no one does Office tools better than Office, right? And the small mid-sized business, that's a confusing area. So let's talk about the choices and risks and opportunities related to making email choices. Nope, you're on mute.
Touched on this a bit earlier. in terms of looking at where the starting point is for most folks. They're likely in a non-compliant environment or in commercial, and they decide to use those compensating controls, right? Or they're going to just not have it be an email, or have CUI stored elsewhere in an enclave that is not email enabled. But at the end of the day, if you start looking at the big decision, and you probably catch me on a dozen webinars doing this, comparing and contrasting, commercial to GCC and GCC high, it begs a question now that everybody has to answer is, looking at the fact that there's many different categories of CUI, some of which do have those additional caveats, right, for no foreign or for export controlled data, etc. And if there's any ambiguity whatsoever, our recommendation is then to leverage our U.S. sovereign cloud that was really baseline to protect all levels of controlled and classified information, including export controlled data. But there's also, a large cross section of GCC high, customers that work with a lot of other subcontractors and suppliers, or even if you look at it from the lenses of an SMB company, that they may say, hey, our company does not actually have data handling for export controlled data, ITAR, EAR, et cetera, in which case they may choose to go down the path of GCC. In any case, it almost always requires some sort of a migration, right? Going from commercial to GCC. If you can avoid the double hop of going from GCC to GCC high, that's also a huge consideration. But that is a major consideration that folks have, and there's of course third-party products that are out there that can help facilitate marketing and labeling. And we're not saying that you shouldn't do that, like just because the cloud baseline for security, like in GCC high, does include US persons and US locations, et cetera, you still should identify that CUI, market, use all the data protections we have built into the platform, such as purview information protection, et cetera, to identify and additionally protect that data. And that all fits into the model with secure by default, right? Having the right configuration that would support labeling, for example, of CUI.
Okay, I wanted to touch really quickly on something. It's probably going to come up. Is many people don't know the difference between a VPN and a VDI. We use all these acronyms, and we think that there's discernment between the two. So, Richard, can you talk about the difference really between a VDI and VPN and how they work differently?
Yeah, so a VDI is essentially a pane of glass, right? Where you can be able to control the endpoint and the compliance and configuration of that endpoint, regardless of what the physical device is, right? So oftentimes you'd think, hey, I've got a physical device, it's a laptop that I have, and today it's connected to the commercial side of the house. You have two choices. You can either lift the compliance of that laptop and the OS sitting on it to NSA 171, or you can choose to give them a different pane of glass, which is a virtual desktop. In the case of Microsoft, we've got Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365 desktops. And, you can put policies in place that say that you would block exfiltration of data from coming from that VDI session down to the physical device, right? Now, if you think about it from a VPN perspective, the VPN is saying that whatever the base OS is of that device typically is going to basically tunnel into and have a network connection to wherever your systems reside that have CUI on them. I don't know if they're necessarily always mutually exclusive, because VDI could certainly take advantage of VPN connections, but it really is about what the true endpoint is in the case of, for example, a physical device. And I get into this conversation quite frequently now with customers because, they're almost always straddling between like a non-compliant environment like commercial and GCC high.
Right.
And we're like, where's your boundary? Well, if you got all these devices out there, and they're not compliant, right? That you want to be able to say, here is my clean line of demarcation. Here's my system boundary. It's in scope for my enclave that I'm going to get assessed. But then you got all these clients connecting over to the commercial side of the house. That's a very difficult situation for folks to be in. So they're building these VDI workstations as that perimeter, right? That they can have trusted devices and endpoints, and put in policies in place, like, for example, prohibiting connections to those applications and services or email unless it's one of the compliant trusted devices, and that could
Right.
be the VDI or mobile device and whatnot.
Okay.
And-
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, that's that's good. I know we're getting short on time.
No, we're fine. The Anthony, let's talk about from the managed services perspective, or better yet, the small business. So if I'm thinking about, okay, well, this VDI thing sounds good. How is that going to help me save money or time getting compliant with my 50 or 75 devices that I've got in a small CNC shop or manufacturing? How's that going to help me?
Certainly. I mean, on the surface, it ends up being a CapEx, capital expenditure versus operations expenditure sort of consideration. In a VDI environment, regardless of where it is, you're not buying, as the SMB, business owner, business leader, you're not buying that infrastructure. That's a subscription. So, following growth, your flats are costs. Your costs are flat, rather. When it comes to being onboarded into that solution, or onboarding that solution, based on how you look at it. So that's a huge advantage. There is, the traditional IT team doesn't come and say, hey, we need $158,000 for X, Y, and Z, eyes glaze over, what have you, because the justification can sometimes be murky. Justification is very clear. Hey, here's the flat rate monthly subscription. Here's
Right.
the time it'll take to onboard. We go through this migration. On the other side of this, we inherit these compliance and security benefits. In many cases, the justification kind of writes itself, really, in comparison to the alternatives. I mean,
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And when I'm thinking about the time that's going to take for me for my IT guy to retrofit those legacy devices with configuration management and getting stripping off least functionality and meeting those sorts of requirements, have you seen a time savings for when I've got an organic IT guy that works for me or part-time? Is that a time savings for him and for me?
Certainly is. VDI onboarding typically is measured in weeks, and that includes migration of data, user training, confirmation of functionality and access, things of that nature. Marshaling forward, legacy IT systems. I think everyone, all the practitioners on the panel here, we've all seen situations where you're 18 to 24 months, if you're a 50 employee or larger organization, because you can't put holes in the boat while you're relying on said boat. And so it's very careful, very deliberate, and kind of naturally delayed, because you have to continue making money day to day on the systems that you're trying to marshal forward into a compliant posture.
Yeah, I often remind people that NIST 800-171 is written from the perspective of a clean slate. It's not intended to instruct you how to retrofit your current environment that has this data in it, right? And so people think, okay, well, if I started access control and I just work my way through, all of a sudden I'm in system communication. I'm like, oh my God, I don't think we're going to make it. I don't think my legacy system has got the wheels on it, right? And then all of a sudden you're like, all of this time and circumstance, now I've got to go shop for something or this capital expense buying brand new computers. And that can be very very cumbersome and very many IT either MSP or IT teams have had to go back to the well and ask for more water, because the fact that they didn't realize that what they got 3/4 of the way through this, and they didn't realize that that their system wasn't, or their legacy devices really just weren't going to make it, right? Or it was just too many hours that they just couldn't retrofit all of the legacy devices. So let's talk about in sort of a wrap up here. And in the sense that, I love this idea of hand in glove. And that's really why we started working on our documentation set, really Les and I, 4 years ago, probably. Probably maybe almost five now. In the sense that we realized
Pushing 5.
both pushing 5, yeah. Because we as a advisory firm realized how truly difficult this was for us to understand the requirements, to understand policies and procedures, to make them comprehensive enough and detailed enough and instructive enough for someone to actually do it instead of paying us to do it, which is extraordinarily expensive, right? And so it's taken us a very long time to be able to develop that reference architecture that's accurate and consistent with the standard and comprehensive enough to provide the implementation guidance to tell people what to do in whatever their part is. If they've got a really great managed service provider, and that managed service providers, has got a conglomeration of resources, a Microsoft, cloud services in combination with maybe hybrid, depending upon what's on premises, then the reality is that they need that extra guidance to really get them through, because I not only have to meet my policies and procedures requirements, and people have to understand them, but also have to be able to produce the evidence which demonstrates that the fact that I've met these requirements. So when we think about this in terms of bringing these pieces together, Richard, do you think this is the future, or do you think it's really, how long do you think it's really going to be before we really come together and we really start thinking this in terms of hand in glove instead of just technology, sort of this composite or this hodgepodge of technologies that we're band-aiding or super gluing together? Really start thinking of it as, and think of it in terms of providers coming together to provide turnkey solutions. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think it's optional. We've talked about this many times about, hey, there's 70 to 80,000 companies that would have a requirement or flow down for DoD contracts alone. And that's a whole lot that, would benefit from being able to have more of a repeatable turnkey solution that is also lower cost. I mean, you've seen all of the debate, especially around CMMC and the rulemaking process being a concern around the cost to the SMB.
Right.
So how can those costs be brought down? And that would be through repeatable and known configurations that can, I wouldn't say be type approved, but that would be have a training and assessment readiness and so forth, so that the assessors themselves are familiar with these environments. And all they'd have to do is come in and, for example, do an assessment of the delta of where they're coloring outside the lines, or have unique requirements for IoT or OT, et cetera, for on-premises. In which case, that, as I mentioned earlier, is that path to acceleration to compliance and cost reduction.
Yeah, I agree. Anthony, from your perspective, do you have a challenge with customers who think, oh, well, now I don't have to do anything, aren't you supposed to do everything for me? Or do they realize that there's still sweat equity, right? Do they still realize that that CMMC can't be done by the IT guy, right? Either in partnership with an extraordinary managed service provider and cloud services offerings. But at the end of the day, we can't leave it up to the IT girl or IT guy to get this done. That it really does take operations and the other CUI stakeholders to do their part when it comes to policies and procedures and training.
Yeah, we traditionally find the IT practitioners pretty clear-eyed. And usually it's a few months before they begin blinking again as they really get into this process. But we do certainly have, we do experience those business leaders that feel like, we signed a quote in a contract, the IT nerds in the corner have it, the MSP, they have this, I don't have to worry about anything. And so what we've done to kind of adapt to that over the years is, much as Richard kind of indicated, Microsoft has done a great job of, kind of saying, here are the placemats, as I think that's your term for it, Richard, for saying, here are the controls, here's what you handle, here's what we handle, and so on. we take that, we sharpen that a little bit. And there's actually a business leader, business owner document that we have that control by control. We say, hey, this is absolutely your responsibility. This is shared responsibility. This is a Hoplite responsibility. And they're color coded. And when we hand that over, everything that is handled by Hoplite is filtered out. And they have to stare very clearly at the things that they must do. And while we're not here to be the consultants on that, we are, for better or worse, among the remaining enforcers of that. So if there is an issue, if there's, the annual reporting, whatever the case may be, we're there to kind of poke at them and prod them forward, in a loving way. It's, you never want that to be contentious, but there are those reminders, because it's, I think, very easy for SMB business leaders and owners to kind of say out of sight, out of mind, and they end up being absent for a period of time in some very critical junctures of their journey. And so we've tried to adapt over time to that, but that's certainly a concern. And I think changing that piece of culture, changing the human element of that is sometimes the hardest.
Well, you guys have been, as we wrap it up, apologies to the audience. So we're not going to have time for questions today, but I just want to say, my personal gratitude for each of you guys and your leadership in this ecosystem and in the challenges that we face, both at the small business level, at the mid-size company level, certainly within our primes and our supply chains, and across really our national security interests, that what you do every single day and the extraordinary level of effort that you contribute to what we do, I am genuinely grateful for each of you. I've known both of you for quite some time. I would take a bullet for either one of you. And I am just immensely grateful for who you are, what you represent, and the skill sets you contribute to meeting the challenges and leading into the CMMC ecosystem. So and I'm also appreciative of your time today, and hope to bring you guys back for other topics in the future.
Thank you for the opportunity. Sincerely appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome. Well, with that, I'm sorry, Richard, go ahead.
I said feelings mutual.
Well, I can't really express that enough. You guys are truly extraordinary, and I am very grateful. And I know other people in this CMC Industry Standards Council and people across the ecosystem that are struggling really genuinely appreciate both of you very much. Well, with that, we got a CCP class coming up, as I mentioned earlier. And Dave Gray also has his CCP class coming up. So if you know him from LinkedIn, please reach out to him because he is an extraordinary, very gifted instructor.
Tara as well.
Yep. And Tara Lemo, that's right. And Tara's wonderful as well. And we've also got, so that's through SMU that we do that. We've got a Mythbusters coming up. Les, when is that Mythbusters? It's at the end of this month, right? End of June?
You can't do that to me.
Well, I sprung that on.
June.
So, yeah, keep up for that. So that's a really training education series where we get in the nitty gritty of doing this and what you need to know to actually execute this.
5th.
June 5th. Okay. And then also, folks, we've got, as I mentioned, we've got Dr. Ron Ross coming up with NIST 171 discussion about the revision 3. And that's next Thursday at 1 p.m. So he is an extraordinary individual, and that's going to be a fascinating discussion. And I genuinely appreciate him giving us the opportunity as the first interview about these requirements after the release of NIST 171 revision 3. And then last, I want you to be encouraged that we can do this. We can do this. Together, we can secure America's defense supply chain. We can climb this mountain, baby steps, with the extraordinary people that are leaning into these requirements and helping you navigate this and navigate the important decisions that you're making, and trying to provide you our best effort to help you navigate these requirements and support that sweat equity that you're contributing to both your business and your competitive advantage, our prosperity, and of course, our national security. So I thank you for that effort as well. Everyone have a wonderful day. TGIF to all, and we will see you next week with Dr. Ross. Have a great day.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.